Hello and welcome to the Tattered Bible Podcast, where we study to show ourselves approved. Please like, share, and subscribe. There's also a thing at the bottom of every video. There I have my link tree, and if you go to my link tree, you can find all my other socials for this channel. Churches that I don't have a long list of churches yet, but there will be one day, and some books that I endorse. So, and other YouTube channels that I endorse. So, go check that out. So today we have Paul Vendredi on, and without further ado, here is Paul Vendredi.
Jacob, thanks for having me. It's going to be a fun show, I hope.
You're welcome.
Yeah, well, you brought me on here because the topic that we're going to talk about is what did the church fathers think about the atonement? So we ought to do the Socratic thing right at the top of the show and define our terms. What's a church father? A church father is any writer living between circa AD 100 and 787. The reason we use those numbers is because AD 100 is roughly the death of John, the last of Christ's apostles, and 787 is the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which was the last of the ecumenical councils. Unless, as a couple of my friends, you count the Phocian Council as the Eighth Ecumenical Council, but that's irrelevant for now. There's also a strong regional component to this definition. Most of these people, whom we call church fathers, lived in the East Roman, or as we call it now, Byzantine Empire. There are some exceptions to that. Today, we're going to be looking at Clement of Rome. Obviously, he was in Italy. And another man, Irenaeus. He was in Gaul, which is now France. Jacob, our next word is atonement. Atonement, lexically defined, means reparation for a wrong or an injury. When I say lexically defined, I'm simply saying if we flipped open a dictionary, this is the meaning we would get. The dictionary tells us atonement means reparation for a wrong or an injury. But when people like us are in the theological arena and we're talking about the work of Christ, we throw around the word atonement a lot more loosely. So if somebody says to you, Jacob, what's your model of the atonement? What he's actually asking you is, what do you understand the life, death, and resurrection of Christ to have accomplished? All right, those are our definitions, Jacob. What I'm going to do now is the subscribers may be shocked, appalled, and dismayed to find this, but we did not select the church fathers that we're going to be looking at today. Somebody else did that for us. Why don't you explain what happened there?
So a few months ago, I think it was in May, I corrected a fellow Oneness Pentecostal. So I'm a Oneness Pentecostal for people who don't know. And there was a fellow Oneness Pentecostal online by the name of Clayton Killian. And I forget the exact statement he made. But he made this statement that sounded dangerously close to penal substitution. And so I decided to try to correct him a little bit. And it's stirred up a hornet's nest. And in this hornet's nest is a person that claims to be Eastern Orthodox called Orthodox Ensign. And Orthodox Ensign has a thread that is basically a Russian nesting doll of other threads full of church father quotes on atonement that he claims prove penal substitution. And so I went and I found 9 or 10 of these quotes and I forwarded them to Paul, and these are the ones we're doing today.
Right, and I rarely get on the platform known as X. When I do, it's usually just to advertise a new playlist that I've put onto Christian Theological Archive, which is one of my 2 YouTube channels. But when I got on to do that, I saw a notification that my name had been used in vain. So I clicked on it to see what it was. And sure enough, it was Jacob Seiler tangling with the Orthodox Ensign. And in one of the Orthodox Ensign's quips, he or she, I'm assuming it's a he accused me of blasphemy. I'm always fascinated when people do that, so I wanted to know more about this. And you got in touch with me a couple months thereafter, and it was not related to that subject, but we decided that it would be a good subject to do a show on. So what you did is you amassed screenshots of all the church fathers he had quoted, and you sent them on over to me. What I did from there is I looked up the quotations and I tried to use the translations that he was using each time. Sometimes the translation wasn't specified. So in those instances, I just defaulted to the Philip Schaff translation because those are readily available for free online. And if anybody is interested in the church fathers, I rarely give free advertising, but ccel.org is a great website. Lots of material available for free, including the entirety of the church fathers in the Schaff translation. So I highly recommend that people go there. It takes just seconds to download all of those church fathers as PDFs. It's well worth a person's time. All right, enough on that background. Jacob, what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the mistakes, just general mistakes that Orthodox Ensign and people like him make when looking at the church fathers. When people say that penal substitutionary atonement or something akin to it is found in the church fathers, these people are usually making one of three mistakes. The first one, and the most common, is called the fallacy of hypostatized proof. Again, the fallacy of hypostatized proof. This is when a person mistakes a historical event for the received construal of that event. In other words, there is a difference between a historical event and the spin that people later put on that event. The spin is not the event. Exactly. So when Christ repeatedly says he has to die and then says on the road to Emmaus that it was necessary that he suffer, atonement schoolers like the Orthodox Ensign immediately read PSA into this. PSA is short for penal substitutionary atonement. But it's not dummies making this mistake. Even the grandees of the Atonement School, William Lane Craig, who is hailed as one of the two smartest Christian philosophers in the world, only behind Alvin Plantinga, also makes this mistake. If you listen to Bill Craig say stuff about the atonement online, you will hear him making this mistake. Looks like you want to say something, Jacob. Go ahead.
Give me 1 minute. You can continue while I'm gone.
Roger that. So what we're dealing with in reality is every model of the work of Christ accounts for Christ's suffering and dying. It's not just PSA. Okay, there I said that every model accounts for the suffering and dying of Christ. What are some of these models? There are about 7 as I enumerate them.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah, Jacob, in case you missed anything, I don't know if you were hearing that over the speakers. We've moved on to discussing what the different models are that can explain the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Notice I didn't call them models of atonement because that already skews things in favor of understanding the life, death, and resurrection of Christ as atonement. So, Jacob, the first one we're talking about is a school of models that I call bait and switch models. I also abbreviate that to BS models. You can tell I'm not a fan of it. These kind of models envision the cross as a mousetrap, Christ as the piece of cheese on the mousetrap. And when the little mousey called Satan tries to snatch the cheese, the mousetrap snatches him. Or they envision the cross as a hook and Satan is the big fish and Christ is the worm on the hook, things like that. They're very imaginary, and in my opinion, they're fantastical. However, they do appear in church fathers like John Damascene, so we have to reckon with them. But that's one way of understanding the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Another model is called the Christus Victor model. That's what Gustav Aulén called it. We could call it, for clarity, the Christ the Conqueror model, because if we call it Christ Christus Victor, we immediately wrap up in people's head Gustav Aulén's book. And I don't necessarily agree with everything that's in that book, so I usually call it Christ the Conqueror model. In order to explain what this is, I am going to quote from the aforementioned John Damascene. This is from his book, The Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith, Book 3, Chapter 12. Quoting, "For the purpose of God the Word becoming man was that the very same nature which had sinned and fallen and become corrupted should triumph over the deceiving tyrant and so be freed from corruption." End of the passage. So basically what the Christ the Conqueror or Christus Victor models say is that Christ triumphed over Satan on the cross. Now that one's hard to get around because Colossians 2, Hebrews 2, 1 John 3:8, and a number of other passages in the New Testament directly say that. So clearly this idea has to be reckoned with, and either that model has to be accepted or it has to be incorporated into a larger model. Moving on, we're on the third model of atonement. I hate to use that phrase, but we're on the third model. This is called the moral exemplar model. The big name here is a medieval figure named Peter Abelard. Abelard's approach emphasized that Christ's life and death were meant to demonstrate God's love and inspire moral transformation in humanity. That's hard to get around too, because it says in 1 Peter, "For even hereunto were ye called," and it goes on to explain how Christ suffered for us and we are supposed to follow Christ's example. This is all over 1 Peter. So as with the other model, this one has to be reckoned with, and if it's not taken on its own, it somehow has to be incorporated into a larger model. The model we're coming to now is PSA, penal substitutionary atonement, vicarious atonement, substitutionary atonement, satisfaction theory of atonement. These are all variants thereof. This is the model that's held by your friend Orthodox Ensign. So when Orthodox Ensign reads church fathers, or when he reads the New Testament, and Christ and the apostles are going up to Jerusalem, and Christ says it's necessary that the Son of Man die and be lifted up. Hey, says Orthodox Ensign and people like him, this means PSA. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Christ is going up to Jerusalem and he's going to be killed because the Father's pouring his wrath on him. Yeah. They're envisioning the entire machinery of substitution, punishment, atonement, penalties, all of that without due warrant. Okay, we're moving down to the next model, and this is also a school of models. It's called the various ransom theories. You can't just say there's the ransom theory. You have to say ransom theories because there are at least 3 of them. Christ could have been ransomed to death, devil, or deity. Christ calls himself a ransom in Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28. There's no getting around this. The question is he ransomed to death? Is he ransomed to the devil? Or is he ransomed to God? Most atonement scholars say the latter, that he's ransomed to God. My favorite church father, Gregory of Nazianzus, says it's none of the above, and I happen to side with Gregory of Nazianzus on that one. No surprises. In my opinion, the ransom model can be eliminated from the pool of viable considerations, but we still have to have it there because people talk about it when discussing the atonement. Moving on to a very interesting model. This is a model known as recapitulation. The big name here is Irenaeus, whose works we're going to look at in just a bit. Irenaeus believed that Christ recapitulated all stages of human life, thereby sanctifying each stage and reversing the effects of Adam's fall through that recapitulation. It's a great theory. I really like it, and it's very similar to the final model that I'm going to bring up, and this is the restored icon model. I didn't make this model up. It was made up by Gregory of Nazianzus and Athanasius and other 4th century church fathers. I simply slapped a name onto it and tried to refine it a bit. As I mentioned, Athanasius and Gregory are the big names associated with it. The motto that we can use when explaining and describing this model is, that which he hath not assumed, he has not healed. This idea is very similar to Irenaeus's recapitulation model, but it has more emphasis on human cooperation with God. Okay, we've gone through a lot of material there describing the fallacy of hypostatized proof. Did you want to jump in before I move on to the next common mistake?
Yeah, so would you say that the older models, not penal substitution, not satisfaction, not governmental atonement, which are all three variations of the same thing, but the older models, that they depend on the entire life of Christ for salvation?
I'd say that's right. And you touch on something really interesting, because there is actually a division in the atonement school over whether the life of Christ has value.
Yeah.
I dropped a term, and I've dropped it a couple of times already. I use the term atonement school. Atonement school refers to modern Christians, especially Protestants, who have built on the work of Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm of Canterbury lived from 1033 to 1109. A great figure of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Anselm was the one who first posited the idea of this whole machinery of substitutions and penalties, that God's honor has been offended and it has to be placated with the death of Christ, who is a perfect man because he's a God man. So the atonement school are people who build on top of that in the modern age. There are atonement schoolers who say that the whole package, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, is salvific. Every inch of it is salvific. That'd be the position that I take. That would be the position that most people within Eastern Orthodoxy take. And I call that the soteriological understanding of Christ's life. However, there are some important figures who do not hold that view. For example, my one-time hero, the great apologist and counter-cultist Walter Martin, in his book called Essential Christianity, states that the Bible nowhere tells us that the life of Christ is salvific. According to Walter Martin, the Bible tells us that only the death of Christ is salvific. And in fact, he takes a swipe at Irenaeus for insisting that Christ's life has soteriological value. Another two other names. Sorry, go ahead.
Isn't there a passage? I'm thinking of a passage that I heard the other day. There's a passage that says something about we're saved by his life, or
Yeah,
something.
it's in
like
Romans.
That. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it's Romans 9. I'd have to look up the exact quote for you, but yes, that's a verse that resonates in our head anytime somebody says that. And I was really surprised to find Walter Martin writing that. In fact, all through the 1990s, I had consumed just about every audio recording Walter Martin had made. I got to his books a little later in life, probably in the 2000s. And then I never got to Essential Christianity until maybe 2 years ago. And that was the first time I had ever find him making that claim. So it's not something that he camped out on. However, he did make the statement in a book of systematic theology, which is interesting. Some other people who are associated with this instrumental view, where the life of Christ has no soteriological value, are supposedly Louis Sperry Chafer and Millard Erickson. Those are two well-known systematic theologians in Protestantism. The reason people believe that they believe that is because in their books on systematic theology, the passages on the atonement are silent about the life of Christ and only speak about the death of Christ.
Yeah, I found the passage. Oh yeah, right here. Hold on, I'm bringing it up just to so let's see, it's verse, where are we? Wait a minute, it jumped on me. I had it. Wait a minute, where'd it go? I'm sorry, keep going. I'm going to look for it some more. I had it. It's in
The,
here somewhere.
the bottom line of all of this is that if we want to make the claim of the instrumentalists, and that is the claim that only the death of Christ is soteriological and salvific, if we want to say that the life of Christ is nothing more than a conveyor belt that gets Christ from the birth canal of Mary and onto the cross of Calvary, then we're going to have to do that athwart that verse that you were searching for.
Five. It's 5:10. Okay, so it did jump on me. 5:10. 5:10. Okay, so 5:10. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life.
That's the very passage.
Yeah. Wanted to read that.
Jacob, we looked at the fallacy of anachronism, the fallacy of hypostatized proof, and in some detail. Let's go on to the next mistake that substitutionary atonement-minded people make when reading the Church Fathers. And that's simply a mistake known as anachronism. When dealing with the Church Fathers, this fallacy usually manifests itself as a type of word concept fallacy. Atonement schoolers have a bad habit of reading their modern understandings into words like ransom, debt, satisfaction, and so forth. They never consider that the words held different resonances in previous times. Okay, the big one there is ransom. We're going to run into that later on in the show. Okay,
Gotcha.
I'm gonna move on, Jacob. The third big fallacy that we run into with people like Orthodox Ensign is the fallacy of the lonely fact. I'm going to explain this by using an image. The image we're going to hold in front of our mind's eye is the image of a big machine comprising scores of subassemblies, and each subassembly comprising hundreds of parts. My finding one part does not mean that I've found the entire machine. Finding one part does not apply the existence of the entire machine, because lots and lots of machines can use interchangeable components. So this is what we talked about the other night. Let's say that you and I are competitors in the same industry, and our competition is neck and neck. We're both striving to be number one in the industry, so we're going to do whatever it takes. It's a cutthroat industry. So one night, I decided that in order to get a leg up on your company, I'm going to do a little bit of industrial espionage. And I break into your machine shop. Luckily for me, your machinists are not the tidiest people in the world. And instead of sweeping up the shop floor like you're supposed to do at the end of second shift, they've left a couple of components strewn out on the floor. So as I'm walking along, I find a 3/8 bolt. I put that in my pocket. I walk along a little bit farther and I find a 3/8 washer. Put that in my pocket. Then I go a little bit further into the building and I find a 3/8 hex nut. Hey, wait a minute. These are components that we use in my machine. Therefore, it must be that Jacob has stolen the plans for my machine and he's making my machine in his machine shop. And what I'm going to do to win this battle is I'm going to bankrupt and devastate him with lawsuits. Well, that lawsuit is never going to make it to court. And why is that? Because
because I could be making something entirely different with that bolt and stuff. Like you maybe you're making washing machines and I'm making airplanes. We don't know just based off that bolt what I'm making with that bolt.
It is exactly that. Jacob, with now that we've looked at those three major mistakes that atonement schoolers make when reading the Church Fathers and also when reading the New Testament, let's move on to our first quotation. I believe this is slide 1, and it's a slide from the writings of Clement of Rome. Why don't you go ahead and read that to us?
Let us Look steadfastly to the blood of Christ, and see how precious in the sight of God is his blood, which having been poured out for our salvation, brought to the whole world the grace of repentance.
This is a passage that the Orthodox Ensign adduced to prove, quote unquote, that I'm a blasphemer and that you, Jacob, are wrong, and that the church fathers obviously teach substitutionary atonement. Earlier in the show, you and I went over a number of different models that can explain the work of Christ. Why don't we look at this passage through the lens of each of those models? We talked earlier about the bait and switch model. This model comes in different forms. All of them involve the tricking of Satan, whether Satan is tricked and trapped in a mousetrap, or whether he's tricked by trying to gobble up a worm that's on a fishing hook. All of it is about trickery. Let's say that this is our worldview, and this is how we understand the work of Christ. So when I read this statement, quote, which having been poured out for our salvation, end quote, referring to Christ's blood, well, then my answer is, well, of course Jesus' blood had to be poured out. That was necessary to trick Satan.
Yeah, he's like a shark. He smells blood.
Yeah, so PSA need not be inferred. Jacob, let's go to the Christus Victor model, looking at this same quotation through the lens of the Christ the Conqueror model. Again, this is simply the idea that Christ triumphs over Satan on the cross. So I read this passage from Clement, quote, his blood, which having been poured out for our salvation, end quote. Says the PSA school, see, atonement. But I say no, because I'm now looking at this through the lens of the Christus Victor model. Of course, Christ's blood had to be poured out. That was necessary in order to triumph over Satan. PSA need not be inferred. We're going to move on to the moral exemplar model. This was Peter Abelard's idea that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were meant to demonstrate God's love and thereby inspire and transform humanity. So when we put Peter Abelard's lens in front of our eye and read this passage about Christ's blood being poured out, we respond, of course his blood had to be poured out. That was necessary in order to inspire humanity. PSA need not be inferred. We have Jacob the recapitulation model. This is the idea from Irenaeus that Christ recapitulated all stages of human life, thereby sanctifying each stage and reversing the effects of Adam's fall by means of that recapitulation. So when we put Irenaeus's lens in front of our eyes and we read this passage from Clement, we respond, of course Christ's blood had to be poured out. That was necessary in order to recapitulate human death. PSA need not be inferred. Finally, we get down to my preferred model, the restored icon model. Our motto here is that which he hath not assumed, he has not healed. So now we're going to put Gregory of Nazianzus' lens in front of our eye. And when we read this passage about Christ's blood being poured out, we reply, of course his blood had to be poured out. Christ had to assume mortality in order to heal mortality.
Yes.
PSA need not be inferred. All right, Jacob, we've looked at that passage from Clement through several lenses. Do you have any insights you want to add here?
Well, so the blood thing. So under restored icon, for example, under restored icon, the blood is just one step in a series of steps that had to be completed, just like under recapitulation. And it's absolutely necessary for salvation because he has to assume everything that we are.
That is exactly the right description. Yes. And you and I have human blood. Therefore, the man Jesus of Nazareth has to have human blood because Jesus of Nazareth is God in the flesh.
And I want to speak to this too. So some people in the oneness movement, like I am what I consider Orthodox oneness, which means that I believe Jesus is fully God, fully man, that he had everything that we have according to his humanity, and everything that God had according to his deity. And that means that he had a human soul and spirit as well. Now, some oneness, however, want to take the Neo-Apollinarian position. The Neo-Apollinarian position is false. And the reason it's false has to do with atonement. So under the older schools of atonement, you need Jesus to be fully man in order for Jesus to redeem us. And the Neo-Apollinarian position says, well, he doesn't have a human soul or spirit. Well, what he has not assumed, he has not redeemed. But what he added to his godhood, he healed.
Yes, that's the quote that Gregory of Nazianzus wrote in his epistle to Cledonius. Yes, I'm fully on board with you. The Neo-Apollinarian school of thought will work well with the instrumental understanding of Christ's life that we referred to earlier. The instrumental view holds that Christ's life is merely a conveyor belt that gets him from the birth canal of Mary to the cross of Christ. If that's the case, I mean, that harmonizes with the Neo-Apollinarian view, because the Neo-Apollinarian view only requires the most minimalistic hypostatic union. All you have to have on the cross is a body with blood in it so that God in his wrath can spill the blood. But in the older Eastern Christian views, the fine points of the hypostatic union are critical, because soteriology, that is to say, the doctrines of salvation, are inextricably bound to Christology, the doctrines concerning the nature of Christ. So when we say something about Christology, for example, if we say Christ has a human soul, that is to say, a life force that animates a body, we are saying soteriologically that our soul is saved because Jesus has a soul that is fused to his divinity.
I like to think of this as like a three-legged chair. So the three-legged chair sit upon Scripture, and out of the three-legged chair, the three legs are a biblical view of anthropology, a biblical view of Christology, and a biblical view of atonement. And all other doctrines are built upon these three.
And on the subject of biblical anthropology, on my YouTube channel, Christian Theological Archive, I am in the process of uploading a series by the Bishop Callistos Ware on the Orthodox understanding of human anthropology, the Orthodox understanding of anthropology. So that's a series that the subscribers may find interesting if they have the same interests that you do.
Yeah.
All right, Jacob, do you want to, shall we look at this audio clip from Justin Martyr?
Yes. I think I have it loaded up right now. Just give me a minute. Okay. What is going on here?
If then the Father of all wished his Christ for the whole human family to take upon him the curses of all, knowing that after he had been crucified and was dead, he would raise him up, why do you argue about him, who submitted to suffer these things according to the Father's will, as if he were accursed, and do not rather bewail yourselves? For although his Father caused him to suffer these things in behalf of the human family, yet you did not commit the deed as in obedience to the will of God.
No, we're not doing that. Okay. That was the quote. Escape. Paul, you're muted. Paul.
Oh, I regret I was doing the grandma thing and had my computer on mute. All right. What we listened to was Justin Martyr from the Dialogue with Trypho. I believe that was section 95.
Yes.
The reason I suspect that your interlocutor on X used this as a rebuttal of us is because we find in the passage the word curses, accursed, and suffer. Those words invariably trigger in an atonement scholar's mind the whole machinery of penal substitution. So once again, we have the fallacy of hypostatized proof. Now, what Orthodox Ensign has done here is he has read the text while ignoring the text. Justin does not write that Christ was accursed. He writes, here's the quote, "He suffered these things according to the Father's will."
Hi, Warren. Keep going.
He suffered these things according to the Father's will, as if he were accursed. As if he were accursed. Not saying he is accursed. Now, if you want more evidence along this line, we've been reading from chapter 95. Let's go to the chapter immediately previous to this in the Dialogue with Trypho. This is how chapter 94 ends. Quote, "Just as God commanded the sign to be made by the brazen serpent, and yet he is blameless, even so, though a curse lies in the law against persons who are crucified, yet no curse lies on the Christ of God, by whom all that have committed things worthy of a curse are saved." End of the quote. So we go from chapter 94, where Justin Martyr says, no curse lies on the Christ of God, into chapter 95, where Justin Martyr says that Christ was treated as if he were accursed. None of this is a proof for PSA. All right, this is, as I said, the fallacy of hypostatized proof, because the Atonement School has in its mind one of their claims that Christ on the cross becomes a literal curse and the embodiment of sin. A biblically literate person does not make this mistake. All right, the verse that they camp out on is Galatians 3:13. "Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree." If we isolate that from the rest of Scripture, they've made their case. The problem is the same writer in 1 Corinthians 12:3 tells us, "No man speaking by the Spirit of God calleth Jesus accursed."
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, any patristic or biblical reference to Christ as a curse is purely figurative.
Yes. Yeah.
Jake?
Yeah, you can't. No one can call Christ accursed by the Spirit of God, and yet atonement schoolers, especially Reformed atonement schoolers, do it all the time.
Jacob, let's put up onto the screen the audio clip called Irenaeus chapter 1.
I already have it loaded and ready to go. Wait a minute, let me put it to the beginning.
"Since the Lord thus has redeemed us through his own blood, giving his soul for our souls, and his flesh for our flesh, and has also poured out the Spirit of the Father for the union and communion of God and man, imparting indeed God to men by means of the Spirit, and, on the other hand, attaching man to God by his own incarnation, and bestowing upon us at his coming immortality durably and truly. By means of communion with God, all the doctrines of the heretics fall to ruin."
Listeners were able to hear it better than I could. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a very close reading of this, because this is an instance of what we could call the fallacy of complex question when somebody uses this as a proof. Let me explain this. If I played that quote to you from Irenaeus, and then I said, quick, explain that statement, I'd be guilty of the fallacy of complex question. The reason for that is because in the patristic era, people prioritized style over clarity. And in that time period, What was in style was massively complicated compound sentences. What they did was start a sentence, interrupt it with a parenthesis, interrupt that with a parenthesis within a parenthesis, and interrupt that with a parenthesis within a parenthesis within a parenthesis, and then they would finally close the parentheses and complete the sentence. Yeah, we're all such healthy people, aren't we? All right, so the worst offender was Second Constantinople. If you wanted to parody Second Constantinople's anathemas, you would just say, if anyone does not agree with this confusing run-on sentence, let him be anathema. All right, but let's get back to Irenaeus. Can you please put up what we call slide 2?
Slide 2.
All right, this is the text of what we just read.
Oh, sorry.
This is the text of what we just heard, rather. I want you to notice that we start out indented all the way to the left, then we have dark bullets, then we have light bullets, then we have a square bullet, and then we're indented all the way to the left again. These are the parentheses within parentheses within parentheses that I just talked about. The actual sentence is the top and the bottom. So the actual sentence reads, since the Lord thus has redeemed us through his own blood, all the doctrines of the heretics fall to ruin. That's all Irenaeus is saying in this passage. Everything in the middle here is an elaboration on how he redeemed us through his own blood. These first 3 bullet points are the first attempt to explain that. Then you have 2 bullet points under that 3rd bullet point, and they are elaborating on the bullet point. And then you have the square bullet, that's elaborating on the elaborations on the bullet point. And then when he closes that parenthesis, then he finally goes back to the sentence. So again, if we eliminated all the stuff in the middle and just stuck with the heart of the sentence, it would be, since the Lord thus has redeemed us through his blood, all the doctrines of the heretics fall to ruin. This is not penal substitutionary atonement.
No, he's not. He's not really commenting on the atonement. He's commenting on heresy.
Yeah, the only reason the Orthodox Ensign is trying to use this as a proof against the restored icon model and as a proof for PSA is because we have the phrase redeemed us through his blood. Those people in that school commit the fallacy of hypostatized proof. They immediately assume that redeemed us through his blood means PSA, when in fact it can be accounted for by just about any model of the work of Christ.
Also notice, so the penal substitution school, all that is required to redeem us is the blood of Christ. But in this quote, it says he gives his soul for our souls, his flesh for our flesh. And he poured out the Spirit of the Father for the union and communion of God and man. And he just keeps going. So, in penal substitution, you do not have an exchange of soul for souls. It's all about the blood.
I like what you're getting at here, because there are atonement schoolers who insist on the fine points of the hypostatic union, but it really makes no sense to do so. It's a wasted effort. As you pointed out in this quote, Irenaeus tells us that Christ redeems us through his blood by giving his soul for our soul and his flesh for our flesh. That's an abbreviated way of saying he has to assume the entirety of the human condition. And I'll state it again. All that is really necessary in penal substitutionary atonement is that Christ have some kind of body that has some kind of blood in it. That's all that's necessary, because all that it ultimately boils down to is Christ spilling his blood on the cross.
And actually, there's 2 contradictory parts of penal substitution. So there's the blood part, which would insinuate some form of Apollinarianism. But then there's what they do, and I think this statement is at the end of Matthew. There's what they do with Christ's quote of Psalm, is it Psalm 22?
Yeah, Psalm 22, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah. There's what they do with that, which what they do with that is would literally, whether you are oneness or Trinitarian, it would literally rip God in half. And so there is another sense in which it almost makes more sense for a penal substitution person to be a Unitarian. Like a strict, like Socinian Unitarian or something.
Yes, and we were talking that we were speaking off air that we may be joined later on by your podcasting partner, Jordan. And Jordan wanted to know why PSA was not compatible with other models. Why can't we say that all of these models are compatible? And it gets down to exactly what you said. The Atonement School makes claims about the atonement that are simply not tenable for anybody on this podcast. So from the Eastern, one of the claims is claim number 15 of 17, that God turns his back on the crucified Christ, abandoning him. And this is the my God, why hast thou forsaken me incident. From the Eastern Orthodox perspective, that's ridiculous because it requires a divided Trinity. And from the Oneness Pentecostal perspective, it's ridiculous precisely because it requires a Trinity. So this is a theory that does not play well with other theories. Jacob, unless you want to talk any further on that subject, maybe we can go to clip 3, which is Irenaeus again.
Just a minute. I'm having... Did we lose our stream? I don't think so. Okay.
All right, you just came back on.
Yeah, it died on me for some reason, but I don't think we lost our stream. I think everything's still going.
Yeah, up in the corner it still says live, and there's a ticker.
Yeah. Okay. I think as long as one of us are on here, I don't know what happened.
All right, well, let's blast through these lest this happen again before we're finished. Let's go to audio clip 3 of Irenaeus.
And thus, as the human race fell into bondage to death by means of a virgin, so is it rescued by a virgin, virginal disobedience having been balanced in the opposite scale by virginal obedience. For in the same way the sin of the first created man receives amendment by the correction of the first begotten, and the coming of the serpent is conquered by the harmlessness of the dove, those bonds being unloosed by which we had been fast bound to death.
With regard to this quote by Irenaeus, I have no idea why Orthodox Ensign thinks this is a proof of PSA. This quote destroys his own case. The sentence preceding the one we played reads, quote, that the Lord then was manifestly making a recapitulation of that disobedience which had occurred in connection with the tree, end quote. Irenaeus uses the word recapitulation at the top of this paragraph. The recapitulation model and the restored icon model are species of the same genus. Recapitulation models say that Christ reversed all the damage done to humanity by the same means by which the damage was done originally. Restored icon models say that Christ healed the damage by fusing the damaged part to his own divinity through the hypostatic union. Those two ideas are really close. In fact, they overlap each other. Both of those beautifully accommodate this passage by Irenaeus. I mean, look at this. The human race fell into bondage by death by means of a virgin. So is it rescued by a virgin. That's the whole mirror image, the whole idea of recapitulation. This is not PSA by any stretch of the imagination.
Let me see if I can play devil's advocate here. Let me see. So, what I think he might be doing is that part of penal substitution is substitution, substituting one thing for something else. And in this passage, it talks about by one virgin's disobedience, we were all condemned. So by virginal obedience, we are all redeemed. And it keeps making statements like that throughout, which a PSA guy reads and thinks substitution.
When PSA talks about substitution, it's talking about the substitution of innocence for guilt. It's talking about the substitution of a God-man for those who are actually guilty. Because in PSA, the idea is that the only commodity valuable enough to recompense God for his stolen honor is the shed blood of a God-man. Therefore, the second person of the Trinity, again, most PSA people are Trinitarians, the second person of the Trinity becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth so that he could be the substitute for humanity. If they then want to say that that idea of substitution is what Irenaeus is saying here, they are stretching it to the breaking point.
I understand that. I just wanted to say maybe that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I think what he's doing here is I think that this is, again, a type of the fallacy of hypostatized proof. So he sees anytime you have the word redemption or anything like that, it is immediately invested with all of their baggage. Jacob, maybe we can move on to Athanasius. This will be clip number 4, Athanasius on the Arians.
Okay.
Formerly the world, as guilty, was under judgment from the law. But now the Word has taken on himself the judgment, and having suffered in the body for all, has bestowed salvation to all.
Jacob, are those audio clips coming through loud and clear on your headphones?
They're coming through fine on my headphones.
All right, yeah, I'm hearing them. They're just a little faint. No worries.
Warren was saying the clip is very low, and I don't know how to turn it up. I've turned up my computer as loud as it'll go. I've turned up the clip as loud as it'll go, and my system for playing things from playing audio from my computer doesn't have
all right, well, no worries about that, Jacob. That's just a technical issue. We can still see the text on the screen, so we're fine. All right, let's get down to our analysis of this passage. This is from Athanasius's first discourse on the Arians. So I'll read the passage. It's a very short one. Formerly the world, as guilty, was under judgment from the law. But now the Word has taken on himself the judgment, and having suffered in the body for all, has bestowed salvation to all. All right, now a person's inclination in reading that is that inclines a little bit more toward the PSA school than it would toward any other school of thought. But the statement is so ambiguous, it could be used by any side to mean anything. Let's look at other parts of that discourse to find out what Athanasius's frame of mind is regarding Christ's work. Again, we were quoting from the first discourse on the Arians. I'm going to go down to paragraph 47 thereof. This is a long quote, so bear with me. Quote, "If then for our sake he sanctifies himself, and does this when he has become man, it is very plain that the Spirit's descent on him in Jordan was a descent upon us because of his bearing our body. And it did not take place for promotion to the word, but again for our sanctification, that we might share his anointing, and of us it might be said, Know ye not that ye are God's temple, and the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? For when the Lord, as man, was washed in Jordan, It was we who were washed in him and by him. And when he received the Spirit, we it was who by him were made recipients of it. End quote. In other words, everything that Jesus does redounds to our benefit. That is both recapitulation and especially restored icon model. So this is the model that Athanasius has in his head. Thus, when we read that previous statement, it should be read through that lens. Let's go down to another quotation, this one much shorter. This is from section 59. Quote, "From Adam unto Moses death reigned, but the presence of the word abolished death. And no longer in Adam are we all dying, but in Christ we are all reviving." End of the quotation. These lines are all about Christ restoring life to us. They have nothing to do with penalties and substitutions.
Yeah.
Well, Jacob, unless you have more words of wisdom, I am going to jump on, or I think we should jump over to John Chrysostom, which is another of our audio clips.
Yes, we will do that right now.
And how did he come between them? He took on himself the punishment that we deserved from the Father and endured the disgrace and insults that we inflicted on God. Do you desire to learn how he assumed both that punishment from on high and these insults here below? It is said, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Galatians chapter 3:13. See then how he received the punishment inflicted from above. Consider how he also endured the insults inflicted here below. The insults of those who insult you, he says, have fallen on me. Psalm 68:10. See how he dissolved the enmity, how he did not cease to do, suffer, and painstakingly perform all things until he had brought the adversary and enemy back to God himself and made him a friend.
All right, that's a rather long quote, so long that I don't want to reread it. I hope everyone was able to hear it. At least they can see it because the text was on screen. What we have here is John Chrysostom saving the appearances. Here's what I mean by saving the appearances. If you're able to explain an isolated Bible passage, then hooray, you've explained a passage and you've staked out a position. If, however, there are several passages on the same topic and your position does not account for those, well, then all you've done is to save the appearances of the first passage. You have not given a true explanation thereof, because you've actually given an explanation that contradicts with other passages in the Bible. I think that this is what's happening here with John Chrysostom. The Bible, especially Old Testament books like Genesis, describe God anthropomorphically as if he is affected, even harmed by human actions. When one bases theology on such anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms, one merely saves the appearances of the passage without giving a true description. I'm aware that Warren is listening, and this may get me anathematized by Warren. I may end up in one of his music videos, but I'm going to press onward here. When one follows John Chrysostom into saving anthropomorphic appearances, i.e. the idea that we inflict punishment and disgrace on God, one follows John Chrysostom into the hermeneutic pit. In the video prior to this one, we heard from Athanasius' discourse on the Arians. Those 4 discourses are replete with passages stating that God is neither mutable nor passible. That is the position that has prevailed in Eastern Orthodoxy. When Orthodox Ensign adduces this quote from John Chrysostom to prove, quote unquote, PSA, he's leveraging a rejected theology, which demonstrates Orthodox Ensign's own heterodoxy. Let's go back to the John Chrysostom quote. John Chrysostom says that he took on himself the punishment that we deserve from the Father and endured the disgrace and insults that we inflicted on God. If we take this passage literally, then we have a passible God. That is to say, a God who can be harmed. And I just said that Athanasius and all the big names of the 4th century said that that's heterodox. Then we have this phrase here, see then how he received the punishment inflicted from above. Okay, yeah, well, punishment, I could say if I ran a marathon, that was an incredibly punishing experience. This is not necessarily saying what Orthodox Ensign wants it to say.
No, so I will just lay my position on the table. I come closer to Warren than to you. But I will say that when it comes to impassibility, even though I believe God has real emotions, that we can actually disappoint him or please him depending on our behavior, I don't think that we can detract from his essence or his nature. I don't think that something we do can cause him not to be the good God he is, or to lie or something like that the Bible says he can't do. And so I would take a very soft position on immutability and impassibility, but I still believe God can't be detracted from.
Yeah, if you're distinguishing between essence and energies, as you just did, the idea that we cannot harm God's energies, but perhaps, or we cannot harm God's essence, but perhaps we can do something to his energies, you might be able to get away with it. And that would be what we call the softer position. I myself incline toward the harder position, because when you read through the 4th century fathers, particularly Athanasius, this is simply inescapable. In the 4 discourses on the Arians, this is all over the place. Impassibility, immutability, inalterability. These are the things he says over and over regarding the character of God, the nature of God. But we probably have a difference of opinion there, so we can just move on, lest we get off topic here. Let's talk about anachronism. And for this, we're going to listen at the audio clip of Diognetus. I think this is clip 6.
But when our wickedness had reached its height, and it had been clearly shown that its reward, punishment, and death was impending over us, and when the time had come which God had before appointed for manifesting his own kindness and power, how the one love of God, through exceeding regard for men, did not regard us with hatred, nor thrust us away, nor remember our iniquity against us, but showed great long-suffering, and bore with us. He himself took on him the burden of our iniquities. He gave his own Son as a ransom for us, the Holy One for transgressors, the blameless one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the incorruptible one for the corruptible, the immortal one for those who are mortal. For what other thing was capable of covering our sins than his righteousness? By what other one was it possible that we, the wicked and ungodly, could be justified, than by the only Son of God? O sweet exchange! O unsearchable operation! O benefit surpassing all expectation, that the wickedness of many should be hid in a single righteous one. But when our wickedness had reached its height, and it had been clearly shown that its reward, punishment, and death was impending over us, and when the time had come which God had before appointed for manifesting his own kindness and power, how the one love of God, through exceeding regard for men, did not regard us with hatred, nor thrust us away, nor remember our iniquity against us, but showed great long-suffering, and bore with us. He himself took on him the burden of our iniquities. He gave his own Son as a ransom for us, the Holy One for transgressors, the blameless one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the incorruptible one for the corruptible, the immortal one for those who are mortal. For what other thing was capable of covering our sins than his righteousness? By what other one was it possible that we, the wicked and ungodly, could be justified, than by the only Son of God? O sweet exchange! O unsearchable operation! O benefit surpassing all expectation, that the wickedness of many should be hid in a single righteous one, and that the righteousness of one should justify many transgressors.
Well, I'm glad to say the audio on that one was a little bit louder. It was still faint, but I was able to hear it.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with the audio.
All right. Yeah,
I
no
don't know
worries
if it-
about that.
I don't
No
know
worries.
if it's okay.
Let's just go ahead and put up the slide 3.
Okay.
Yes, that's the slide right there. So basically, we have 2 parts to this sentence, and we find that it's another of these massive, intricately ramified compound sentences that were so popular and so stylish in the patristic era. These things have not aged well. People in late antiquity thought these sentences were great. We hear them now and just cringe because they're so needlessly confusing. So what we've got here is we've got, as you can see, there's parentheses and parentheses within parentheses again. So let's just look at the numbered sentences. And we read, but when our wickedness had reached its height, going down to the next one, and when the time had come which God had before appointed, number 3, he himself took on him the burden of our iniquities and gave his own son as a ransom for us. All of the other parts of this are just giving further explanation, further elucidation. The main body of the sentence is in the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So basically, all this says is when our wickedness had reached its height and the appointed time had arrived, God gave his own son as a ransom for us. That's what the sentence says. In the Bible, the word ransom means rescue. The word appears in Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28. Here's Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Mark 10:45.
Yeah.
What he is doing, he being your interlocutor on Acts, is the fallacy of anachronism. He's reading the word ransom here and immediately investing it with all the resonances that we have from our suspense movies and our action adventure movies in our modern day. In the action adventure movie, we have the child who's been kidnapped, and the hostage takers inform the parents that they have to drop off $100,000 in unmarked bills in order to get the child back. That's what we nowadays understand ransom to mean. That is probably not the resonance that was in the writer of the Epistle to Diognetus. In Greek, you go ahead.
The closest thing to what he means by ransom here that's in our action movie genre, I forget the name of the movie, but it's a movie by Mel Gibson where they kidnap his son and they ask for a ransom. And Mel Gibson, instead of paying the ransom, says, I will, because he's convinced they're going to kill his son. So instead he says, I will give that amount of money to whoever kills these guys and brings my son to me. And in the movie, this crooked cop that is working with the kidnappers actually decides that he wants the money more than he cares for his fellow kidnappers. So he actually kills all the other kidnappers and brings the son to Mel Gibson, who then decides to pay him the award, but then the son recognizes the cop as the one that kidnapped him, and then there's this showdown scene and that goes on. Anyways, that's the closest in action movies to what he means here.
I am not favorably inclined toward Mel Gibson, so I'm going to reserve any comment on that digression there. All right, we were talking about the word ransom. Okay, the word ransom in Greek is litron. That's the word that appears there in Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28. A cognate of that word, appears in Exodus 6:6 in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek language translation of the Old Testament. Exodus 6:6, this is how it reads in the King James. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you, that's the word, with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. Exodus 6:6 KJV. So the word there in Greek is litrosome, which is translated as redeem in the KJV, and it's an exact cognative litron, which is used in Mark 10:45. Thus, when people in the early centuries of the church were using the word ransom, what they were thinking of was rescue. They were not thinking of paying off a hostage taker for the release of the hostages.
Yes.
All right, Jacob, with regard to the second part of this big long quotation from Diognetus, we had the phrase great exchange. It does not appear on the slide. It appeared in the audio, but I didn't put it up here on the slide. This is something that they love to trade on, they being the Atonement School. The great exchange refers not to the exchange of innocence for guilt. Great exchange refers to the exchange of immortality for mortality.
Mm-hmm.
If it meant an exchange of innocence for guilt, then we'd be contradicting the Bible, because that famous passage in Isaiah 5:20 tells us, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil,
Good evil.
that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. We cannot look upon injustice and proclaim it justice. We cannot look upon innocence and proclaim it guilt. That would be violating God's law. That would be violating God's word in Isaiah. Therefore, your interlocutor's use of Diognetus is just wrong from stem to stern.
Yeah.
Jacob, let's move on to clip 7, which is Irenaeus.
Since he was man and since he was God, in order that, since as man he suffered for us, so as God he might have compassion on us and forgive us our debts, in which we were made debtors to God our Creator, pointing out thus that remission of sins which follows upon his advent, by which he has destroyed the handwriting of our debt and fastened it to the cross, so that as by means of a tree we were made debtors to God, so also by means of a tree we may obtain the remission of our debt.
You probably noticed that passage concluded with the idea of recapitulation, how our fall started at a tree, so it had to be reversed at a tree. Again, this is an idea of recapitulation, and that was Irenaeus's insight into soteriology. The passage also gives us the words debts and debtors, which allows the Orthodox Ensign to ignore the soteriology and simply trade on a word that's beloved to modern atonement schoolers. They love the word debt because it gives us the idea that we have to pay back God something that we've taken from him. All right, PSA comprises 17 claims. 17 claims. The fifth claim goes, all sin is to be thought of as a debt that we owe God for the crime of having robbed him of honor. Again, this is the idea of passibility. The Atonement School's God, even though their systematic theologies insist on God's impassibility, the Atonement School insists on his passibility because they say that we can rob him of honor. Mm-hmm. This was a major stumbling of Anselm. Anselm in his early treatises was all about classical theism, the idea of immutability, impassibility, and so forth. Yet when he got to why God became man, suddenly God went from being the unmoved mover to the very moved mover.
Yeah.
You went from an Aristotelian classical theism to a kind of almost a modern idea of that Protestants have in their lower level preaching. All right, so back to what we said here. We're dealing with what's in your interlocutor's head, which is probably the idea that we have robbed God of honor. and thus he reads that into debts and debtors. Okay, now maybe Irenaeus means that. Irenaeus does not say that we've robbed God of honor. He's not saying that's the debt. And by the way, that would make God passable. But he does seem to indicate that we owe God something. He seems to indicate that in this passage. I mean, it's really hard to get around the word debt and debtor. The lexical meaning of this is the debt is something that's owed, and the debtor is the guy who owes the debt.
Can I pontificate on what I think it is that we owe him?
It's your show. I can't stop you.
I think that
Yeah, we're looking at Irenaeus.
Irenaeus.
Yep.
I think that Irenaeus is laying on something that I found with this first sermon pastor's going to let me preach. I found the passage, be a living sacrifice or something like that. I think what we owe to God that Irenaeus is getting at is our lives, not some debt of honor.
Yeah, I think that would be acceptable to a lot more parties involved here if we owe God a debt of self-offering. And by the way, when we say sacrifice, we don't necessarily mean a blood sacrifice. We could simply mean self-offering.
Yes.
So I would actually be willing to go along with what you said. But let's give your nemesis, Orthodox Ensign, the benefit of the doubt and say that Irenaeus is saying we actually do owe God some kind of moral debt, or maybe blood somehow, some kind of debt for having stolen God's honor. Let's just grant that here. If that were the case, then what we have is just the fallacy of the lonely fact. The Orthodox Ensign has found one component, one piece of hardware that's used in the machinery and infers the entirety of the machinery. So what he has done is he has walked through your machine shop, Jacob, and he's found that 3/8 hex nut, and now he's inferring that you make the same machine that he makes, when in fact the inference is completely unwarranted, because the evidence is too sparse.
Yes. Yeah, for all he knows, I make fighter jets.
All right, we're going to go on now to Melito of Sardis, and I believe this is clip 8.
I've got it right here.
In place of Isaac the Just, a ram appeared. In place of Isaac the Just, a ram appeared for slaughter, in order that Isaac might be liberated from his bonds. The slaughter of this animal redeemed Isaac from death. In like manner, the Lord, being slain, saved us. Being bound, he loosed us. Being sacrificed, he redeemed us.
Oh, sorry.
We just listened to Melito of Sardis, and at this point, we are dealing with something that no Orthodox person wants to deal with, and that's when a church father makes a mistake. There is in Eastern Orthodoxy a contingent that tells us that the church fathers are inspired and inerrant. There are some who want to parse that a little bit and say that they're inspired and inerrant only when they're interpreting the Bible. I don't buy into either of those. I'm not going to be a controversialist on that issue. I'm just going to say I don't buy into it, because there are clear instances of the church fathers making mistakes. In my opinion, this clip from Melito of Sardis is a clip of him making a mistake. Melito tells us, quote, "The slaughter of this animal redeemed Isaac from death," end quote. Well, actually, if you read the binding of Isaac's story in the book of Genesis, the slaughter of the animal is not what redeemed or saved Isaac from death. What saved him from death was the hand of the angel stopping Abraham. Abraham offering the ram after the sacrifice. I'm hearing some noise in my speakers.
Sorry. I was seeing if I could get the clip a little louder on the next one.
All right, the next one is our last one, so it won't be that critical. So I was saying that the ram that Abraham then offers, quote unquote, in place of Isaac is a votive offering. Votive is a term in history of religion and anthropology that means it's a free will offering. Nowhere in the text does it say that God demanded that Abraham substitute the ram for Isaac. Even other church fathers note that fact. Next thing I want to say about Melito's interpretation is this. The rule in hermeneutics is that nothing in the Old Testament is a type of Christ unless the New Testament officially says it is. And the New Testament does not officially call Isaac a type of Christ. And speaking of types, one of the big problems with the binding of Isaac's story is who's supposed to be the type of Christ in the story?
Isaac.
Well, usually they say it's Isaac, but then they tell us that the ram is a type of Christ, but then the angel is called the angel of the Lord. And your former, the guy whom you used to esteem, Mike Winger, says that anytime the phrase angel of the Lord appears in the text, that's the pre-incarnate Christ. So you have a triplet in this story. You have the ram is Christ, Isaac is Christ, and the angel is Christ. What kind of craziness is this? So we have three Christs in the story. Yet Melito of Sardis is wanting to exegete theology from this passage, when in fact the passage is in some senses unusable.
Yes. There's no clear Christological statement in that story.
Right, and the rule of hermeneutics is bothersome to a lot of people like Mike Winger because he has a series, I think, comprising 29 episodes on finding Christ in the Old Testament. Some of it is really interesting, some of it is clever, but the rule is you are not allowed to dogmatize about those things if it is not clearly stated in the New Testament that XYZ is a type. So the New Testament tells you that the rock from which Moses got the water is a type of Christ. So that's a strange one that actually is endorsed by the New Testament, whereas the one that seems a little more normal, which is the binding of Isaac's story, is nowhere officially called a type of Christ in the New Testament.
Yeah. Another one that I don't know if Mike touches on this, but another one they want to try to say is a type of Christ is the scapegoat.
Yeah, if I start talking about the scapegoat, I will go on and on. Let me just say this. I have embarked on a project of reading through the book of Leviticus 30 times. I am currently on iteration 17. So I'm on the 17th read through of the book of Leviticus this year. I've been reading through it one time every week. The book of Leviticus is demonstrably out of order. It appears to have been reassembled. What probably happened is the scroll was destroyed at the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. And what happened is when they came back from the Babylonian exile and were rebuilding the temple, they decided to reconstruct what they had. They probably had some scrolls, and then where they did not have scrolls, they had the people recite it from memory. So very likely they called upon the priests and had the priests recite all of this. And you can see where the sections are. Each of the new sections in Leviticus starts with some variant of the phrase, and the Lord spake unto Moses. So you can know where, what I envision is kind of like a scrum board, where you have all the post-it notes up on the whiteboard, and the post-it notes are all arranged in columns. I sort of envision that happening, and it's being reconstructed. And unfortunately, they did not reconstruct it very carefully. There are parts of chapters 6 and 7. In fact, chapters 6 and 7 should be completely disassembled and merged in with the chapters prior to it, because they're just elaborations on how to do the sacrifices that are described in those earlier chapters. Chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement chapter, is also out of order. Chapter 16 should go after chapter 10, the Nadab and Abihu incident, because this is one of the only places in Leviticus where you actually have a time cue. It tells you that God delivered all this information on the Day of Atonement after the death of Nadab and Abihu. And you'll recall from the story that Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire on the opening day of the temple services, and they were consumed by fire from the tabernacle that destroyed them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put that at where it belongs, which is after the Nadab and Abihu story, it becomes very clear that the two goats are Nadab and Abihu. It is not Christ. If you are looking for Christ in the pages of Leviticus, you are on a fool's errand. Because my thesis regarding the Old Testament animal sacrifices, this is a thesis that I've held for a number of decades, is that the sacrifices that are given to Israel after the golden calf incident are a type of accommodative punishment, a type of punitive accommodation. They wanted to go back to the religion of Egypt with which they were familiar. So God said, okay, you got it. You got all of these sacrifices now. The Day of Atonement is a punishment within a punishment, because this is a punishment strictly for is an ad hoc punishment strictly for the Nadab and Abihu incident. And I have come to believe through these readings of Leviticus that almost the entirety of Leviticus was supposed to be rescinded after the wilderness generation had died off and the children of Israel moved into the promised land. The reason I'm saying that is because there are chapters, I think it's chapter 17, don't quote me on that, where it says if you hunt an animal, you have to bring all of that game to the door of the temple. And if you fail to do so, you're cut off from your people, which was a nice way of saying you would be executed. That rule gets rescinded in Numbers and Deuteronomy. There are also all number of festivals that are added to the original 3 that were given in Exodus 23. We find these added festivals in Leviticus 23. Those added festivals get rescinded in Deuteronomy. So in my opinion, Deuteronomy, which means a second giving of the law, by the way, what Moses was doing was giving the law again without Leviticus to the generation that had succeeded the wilderness generation, because he, Moses, along with Caleb and Joshua, were the only 3 men left from the wilderness generation. And so now it was time to put the new law in place, a little more along the lines of what it was supposed to look like prior to the golden calf.
There's also this thing, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't studied this out, but this is my suspicion. So I know you see the pre-golden calf sacrifices as iconoclasm, and I agree with that assessment. And it's my suspicion that if we were to examine both sets of sacrifices, that you'll find a lot more substitutions of one kind of animal or sacrifice for another in the post-golden calf ones.
Well, my thesis is pretty close to what you just said. The sacrifice, let me actually, before the sacrifices, let me go to the 10 plagues. There are quite a few people throughout Christianity, whether Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant, who say that the 10 plagues were clearly designed to destroy the gods of Egypt. And I talked about this on another forum. And this is the idea that the sheep, the lamb that was slain, was a iconographic destruction of the god Khnum. He was a major creator god in the Egyptian pantheon. He was a ram-headed god. And in fact, there's a couple of interesting books. I just finished reading one by Bezalel Porton. These books are all about documents that have come to light on Elephantine Island, which is way down in the south part of Egypt on the border of Nubia. It's by the first cataract. So this was an island that was sacred to the god Khnum and to his consort Satet. And what happened is there were right about the same time that the temple was being reconstructed by Zerubbabel in the land of Israel, there were Israelite mercenaries that had come into Egypt with the conquering forces of Cambyses, the Persian Shah. And he had settled them as a military garrison on Elephantine Island. So these Jews constructed their own temple to Yahweh. They pronounced it Yahu in that particular dialect. They seem to have come primarily from the north of Israel, Samaritans. So they had a temple of Yahu on Elephantine Island. And one wall of the temple abutted the temple of Khnum. And the priests of Khnum destroyed the temple of Yahu during Passover when they discovered that the priests were sacrificing lambs in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty strong evidence that hundreds and hundreds of years prior, the 10th plague had been designed as a destruction of Khnum. So that's just one example of 10. So when you move on into the pre-golden calf religion that's being passed on to Israel at Sinai, you have a sacrifice that takes place at the foot of Sinai, ratifying the covenant. This is simply ancient Near Eastern practice, A&E. This is a word that crops up all the time in both anthropology and also in Protestant apologetics. They say, well, this or that was just ancient Near Eastern custom. That's why they did it. Ancient Near Eastern custom, when ratifying a covenant, was always to sacrifice an animal or to do something else that was equally dramatic. So you have a sacrifice of animals at Mount Sinai for the ratification of the covenant. And and by the way, the animals were not sacrificed by priests. It just says they were sacrificed by young men. Moses then takes the blood of these oxen and sprinkles the people with it. In my opinion, this is fulfilled when Christ sprinkles many nations, as it says in Isaiah 52 and 53.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a lot of stuff that's going on before the golden calf in Israelite religion, excuse me, that is an accommodation to the type of religion to which they had grown accustomed after 400 years. You don't just change everything at once, so God is weaning them from this. Other examples of accommodation are the designs for the altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant. If you look at the Bark Shrine, Bark is spelled B-A-R-Q-U-E, boat in other words. If you look at the Bark Shrine of Edfu, you're going to say, that looks an awful lot like the Ark of the Covenant, or that looks an awful lot like the altar of incense. In fact, that was probably intentional. God was giving the Israelites something that looked familiar, but he was investing it with new meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the merciful accommodation that happens prior to the golden calf turns into punitive accommodation after the golden calf. So God says, okay, you want more Egyptian religion? You got it. You're going to have all these votive offerings that you have to bring to the tabernacle. Then you'll have the peace offerings. Then you're going to have other offerings that you'll have to make to clean yourself from ceremonial uncleanness. It's a bewildering array of sacrifices, and in fact, it's an incredible burden. It is clearly punitive, but at the same time, it is still mercifully accommodating to these Hebrews who are basically just a species of Egyptian at this point.
Yeah. I think we can move on.
Yeah, I think we're far afield here. Let's go to our last clip. This is clip 9, Athanasius to Marcellinus.
Let me move.
In Psalms 88 and 69, again speaking in the Lord's own person, tell us further that he suffered these things, not for his own sake, but for ours. Thou hast made thy wrath to rest upon me, says the one. And the other adds, I paid them things I never took. For he did not die as being himself liable to death. He suffered for us, and bore in himself the wrath that was the penalty of our transgression. Even as Isaiah says, himself bore our weaknesses.
Jacob, this is another one that's going to be very difficult for me because I like Athanasius. I'm especially fond of his book on the Incarnation. I leaned very heavily on that book for a lot of the Christology that I used in my podcast series on PSA, which is available at paulvendredi.com. So I'm very fond of Athanasius. I used to go to a church that had a big icon of Athanasius near the apse. So it's tough for me to say that it appears that Athanasius has made a mistake in this statement here. We have the concluding sentence of this reads, "And bore in himself the wrath that was the penalty of our transgression, even as Isaiah says, himself bore," I think I got cut off there, "himself bore our weaknesses." He's quoting Isaiah 53:4. Isaiah 53:4 reads, "Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." Okay, we talked about the rules of hermeneutics earlier on. We're going to bring up another rule of hermeneutics. When the New Testament interprets a passage in the Old Testament, that's the final word on what that Old Testament passage means. I think we're all agreed on that.
Yeah.
Isaiah 53:4 is quoted and interpreted in the Gospel of Matthew. Here's what we read. "When the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils, and he cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses." That's from Matthew chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. So what happens there is you have Christ healing people of their sicknesses, casting out their demons. So we're talking about physical and spiritual sicknesses being cured there. And right there, the inspired writer tells us that this is fulfilling Isaiah 53:4. So Isaiah 53:4, "Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows," is fulfilled when Christ heals us of our afflictions. The Bible does not tell you that that is fulfilled on the cross. It tells you it is fulfilled in Christ's healing ministry during his life. So Athanasius in this quote tells us that here's the quote, "And bore in himself the wrath that was the penalty of our transgression, even as Isaiah says, himself bore our weaknesses." Well, that is what Isaiah says, but he doesn't say it's the penalty for our transgression.
Yeah.
Because Matthew gives the right interpretation of that passage. And you know what? If it comes down between a church father and the Bible wins.
The Bible
and the church
wins.
father loses. You want to say something there, Jacob?
Oh, no, I'm in full agreement with you. I guess we're then done. So I want to show Paul some love here. If you have not yet, go and subscribe to his YouTube channels. So here is Paul Vendredi YouTube channel. Here is Christian Theological Archive. Here is paulvendredi.com. And then I mentioned this at the beginning. For me personally, I have this link tree at the bottom of all of my videos. And so if you go down and you go to the link tree link, I have all my socials. I have YouTubers I endorse. I will add Paul a little bit later. I have some good churches. And I have some books here. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe.
Fabulous. Well, I've enjoyed being on. Thanks for having me on, Jacob.
Yeah, yes. If you want to stay a little bit after we end the stream, or you can just leave. It doesn't matter to me.
You can just leave.
Well, I didn't mean that in a rude way. I just, I don't care if you want to chat for a little bit or if you've got to go.
Yeah, I'll stick around and we can talk off air. I'll put myself on mute.
Okay. We're going to pray real quick. Dear Lord Jesus, we thank you for this stream tonight. We thank you for Brother Paul and his years of work and knowledge on these matters. We ask that people get the word out of this that you had intended for them, that this touches lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.